Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. My life operates on a reverse schedule. While the rest of the city is winding down, mine is just beginning. I'm a night shift nurse at St. Michael's Hospital, a job that trades normal sleeping hours for the strange, quiet beauty of a city after midnight. It's a life of quiet hallways, hushed voices, and the steady, rhythmic beeping of machines. This nocturnal existence has shaped all my routines, turning mundane errands into solitary, late-night rituals. The most important of these is my weekly trip to the laundromat. The place is called the Spin Cycle, a generic, uninspired name for a generic, uninspired place. It's one of those 24-hour establishments, a brightly lit box of tile and metal dropped onto a quiet street corner. During the day, I'm sure it's a chaotic hive of activity, filled with mothers and college students. But at 3 a.m, it's my private sanctuary. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, which would be unbearable in daytime, are a welcome beacon in the dark. My apartment, a cozy but small third-floor walk-up, lacks the space for a washer and dryer, a common sacrifice for affordable rent in this city. And so, every Tuesday night, after my shift, I haul my large canvas bag of scrubs and civilian clothes to the Spin Cycle. The ritual is always the same. The rumble of the industrial machines, the warm, humid air, and the clean chemical smell of bleach and detergent. It's a sensory landscape I've come to associate with a strange kind of peace. There's a comfort in the anonymity of the place. It's a space of pure function, designed for the transient needs of people like me. No one is there to make small talk. No one is there to judge the sad, mismatched state of my sock collection. It's just me, my book, and the hypnotic tumbling of my clothes in the large, glass-fronted dryers. In a life that is often filled with the intense emotional needs of my patients, this hour of impersonal solitude is a necessary decompression. The laundromat itself is a study in sterile utility. A long row of white washing machines lines one wall, their chrome doors gleaming under the lights. Opposite them sits a bank of massive industrial dryers. In the center of the room, there are a few worn plastic chairs and a long folding table. The walls are a pale, institutional yellow. The linoleum floor, a checkerboard of black and white, scuffed with the passage of 1,000 strangers. I have my own specific routine within the larger ritual. I always use the third washing machine. From the end, its spin cycle seems to be the most efficient. While the clothes wash, I sit in the orange plastic chair that doesn't wobble, positioned directly under a light that doesn't flicker. I read my book, losing myself in other worlds while the machines churn away, cleansing the grime of my own. It is a predictable, ordered, and controlled environment. The sounds are a constant, comforting symphony. The sloshing of water, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of an unbalanced load, the high-pitched whir of the final spin. Above it all is the constant low hum of the machines and the buzzing of the overhead lights. It's a mechanical lullaby that I've come to find deeply soothing. It's the sound of a process, of something being made clean, and it helps to wash away the stress of my long, often difficult shifts. In all my months of visiting the Spin Cycle late at night, I have rarely encountered another soul. Occasionally, another nocturnal creature like myself will come in, and we will share the space in a silent, mutually agreed-upon truce, occupying opposite ends of the room. We are ships passing in the night, each of us there for our own reasons, respecting the unspoken rule of late-night anonymity. We do not make eye contact. We do not speak. This solitude is what makes the place feel so safe. It is a public space that, for a few hours a week, feels entirely private. It is my own personal laundry room. I can spread my clothes out on the long folding table, sort them without hurry, and take my time. The large plate glass windows at the front look out onto a quiet, sleeping street, the occasional car passing by like a silent ghost. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I feel a sense of ownership over the space during my late-night visits. I know which dryer gets the hottest and which change machine is most likely to jam. These small pieces of knowledge make the place feel familiar, comfortable. It's a non-place, a transitional space, but for me, it has become a stable point in my inverted life. A clean, well-lit place where I can perform a simple, necessary task in peace, shielded from the complexities of the world outside. The warmth that radiated from the bank of dryers was a welcome comfort, especially on colder nights. It created a pocket of dry, cozy heat in the otherwise sterile environment. I would often stand before the large glass doors of the dryers after loading them, watching my clothes and sheets tumble in the dark, punctuated by the occasional flicker of a zipper or a button catching the light. It was a hypnotic, almost meditative experience, a simple pleasure in a complicated world. This place, with its humming machines and harsh lighting, had become an unlikely part of my self-care routine. It was a forced pause, a mandatory hour and a half of inactivity where I was disconnected from the demands of my job and the pressures of my life. Here, my only responsibility was to wait for a cycle to finish. This enforced stillness was a rare gift, and I cherished it, even if it had to happen in the middle of the night in a public laundromat. I felt a certain kinship with the machines themselves. They were tireless, performing their single dedicated function without complaint, day after day, night after night. There was an honesty to their purpose that I admired. They washed, they dried, they made things clean. In my line of work, outcomes were often messy, uncertain, and emotionally draining. Here, the outcome was always the same: a basket full of warm, clean, fresh-smelling clothes. It was a small, weekly restoration of order. My solitude was so consistent that I began to think of the laundromat as an extension of my own apartment. It was a utility room that just happened to be a few blocks away. This feeling of ownership, however illusory, contributed to my profound sense of ease. I never felt vulnerable here. The bright lights and the large windows facing the street created a feeling of exposure that was, paradoxically, a form of security. Nothing bad could happen in a place so brightly lit, so open to the world. On one particularly quiet night, I remember finishing my book just as the final dryer cycle ended. I was left with nothing to do but sit and listen to the symphony of the machines, the gentle thrumming of the motors, the soft clicks of the cooling dryers. The sound was so steady, so predictable. It was the heartbeat of the place. I felt my own breathing sync up with the rhythm of the machines, a strange mechanical meditation. The final part of my ritual was folding. I would empty the warm, fragrant pile of clothes onto the long, cool surface of the folding table and work with a focused, practiced efficiency, sorting socks, folding scrubs, smoothing out the wrinkles in my sheets. It was a mindful, grounding task. It was the final step in the process of bringing order back to my small corner of the world, preparing me for the week ahead. This was my church of cleanliness. As I would pack my neatly folded clothes back into my canvas bag, I'd feel a sense of accomplishment. I had successfully navigated another week, another series of demanding shifts. This small domestic chore was a reaffirmation of my own resilience, my ability to care for myself. It was a quiet declaration that, despite the chaos of my job and the inversion of my schedule I was managing, I was okay. I never worried about my safety during these late-night excursions. I was a city dweller, and I was cautious by nature, but the spin cycle felt different. It felt like a neutral zone, a place outside the normal dangers of the night. It was too bright, too mundane, too functional to be a place of menace. It was a place of fluorescent lights and soap suds, not of shadows and fear. I had found my small pocket of peace in the heart of a chaotic city. The building, with all its groans and murmurs, felt alive, and I was a part of it. I was Alara, the night nurse in 6A. My life was finally, for the first time, starting to feel like my own creation. I was blissfully unaware that my peace was built on a fragile foundation, and that the anonymity of this public space was about to be violated. I had mistaken the mundanity of the laundromat for safety. I believed its sterile, brightly lit environment was a shield. But I was about to learn that terror doesn't always lurk in the darkness. Sometimes it sits in plain sight, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, in the form of a single forgotten item, waiting patiently in the warmth of an empty dryer to be noticed. My peaceful ritual was about to be corrupted. The night it began was no different from any other Tuesday. The hospital had been a controlled chaos, a whirlwind of beeping machines, anxious families, and the quiet, constant pressure of lives hanging in the balance. By the time my shift ended, I was drained, my body humming with a low-grade exhaustion. The prospect of my quiet hour at the spin cycle was a welcome one, a silent buffer between the intensity of my work and the quiet of my apartment. I gathered my laundry bag and headed out into the cool, still night. The laundromat greeted me with its familiar hum and the warm, clean scent of detergent. The vast, plate glass windows reflected my own tired image back at me as I approached, a lone figure in a sleeping city. Inside, the place was empty, as usual. It was my own private world for the next 90 minutes. I loaded my scrubs and clothes into my preferred machine, slid the coins into the slot with a satisfying clank, and settled into my usual chair with my book. The wash cycle finished. I transferred the damp clothes to one of the large industrial dryers, the familiar scent of warm cotton and fabric softener beginning to fill the air. The hypnotic tumble of the clothes behind the large glass door was a comforting sight. It was a process so simple, so predictable, that it allowed my overworked mind to finally go quiet. I sat back down, losing myself in the pages of my book, letting the rhythmic sounds of the laundromat wash over me. The dryer buzzed, signaling the end of the cycle. It was time for the final part of my ritual, the folding. I pulled the warm, clean heap of clothes from the dryer and carried them over to the long, cool folding table in the center of the room. It was a satisfying feeling, the warmth of the freshly dried fabric under my hands, the simple, methodical task of creating neat, ordered piles from the chaotic tangle of clothes. It was as I was folding the last of my scrubs that I first noticed it. My dryer, number 4, had finished its cycle and was now still and quiet. But the dryer next to it, number 5, was also still. And through its large glass door, I could see a single, solitary item of clothing, lying in a small, lonely heap at the bottom of the huge metal drum. It was a child's t-shirt, a vibrant cherry red color that stood out starkly against the gray metal. My first thought was a simple, practical one. Someone had done their laundry earlier, and in their haste, they had missed a single, small item. It was an easy mistake to make, especially for a tired parent juggling multiple loads and probably a tired child as well. I pictured a mother, distracted for a moment, gathering up armfuls of clothes and simply not seeing the small shirt left behind. It was a common, mundane oversight, the kind of thing that happens in laundromats every day. I felt a brief, fleeting pang of sympathy for the anonymous, forgetful parent. I knew the frustration of getting home only to realize a favorite sock or a crucial part of a uniform had been left behind. But it was none of my business. The shirt was a small red island in the large empty machine, a testament to someone else's hurried, stressful day. I finished folding my own clothes, packed them neatly into my bag, and put the shirt out of my mind. As I was leaving, I glanced one last time at the dryer. The red shirt was still there, a small, bright splash of color in the otherwise monochromatic, sterile environment. It looked surprisingly poignant, a tiny, abandoned piece of a child's life left behind in this impersonal, transient space. I felt a momentary urge to open the dryer and retrieve it, to leave it on the folding table where it would be more easily seen. But I stopped myself. It wasn't my place. I walked home through the quiet, sleeping streets, the weight of my laundry, bag of familiar comfort on my shoulder. The image of the small red shirt faded from my mind, replaced by thoughts of my warm bed and the prospect of a few precious hours of sleep before the world woke up and my own day came to an end. It was a minor, insignificant detail in the tapestry of the night, a footnote in the story of my weekly ritual. I didn't know it then, but it was not a footnote. It was the opening sentence of a new and terrifying chapter. I had seen an object out of place, a simple, explainable anomaly. I had correctly identified it as a forgotten piece of clothing and had, quite reasonably, dismissed it. I had no way of knowing that the shirt was not forgotten. It had been left there deliberately. It was not an oversight. It was an invitation. And I was the only one who had been invited to see it. The following week was a blur of long shifts and short, precious hours of sleep. A difficult case at the hospital occupied most of my mental energy. A young man with a severe infection that wasn't responding to antibiotics. My days were filled with the anxieties of my profession. Consulting with doctors, comforting distraught family members, and the constant, vigilant monitoring of vital signs. The small, quiet world of the spin cycle and its single, forgotten t-shirt was completely erased from my mind. Life has a way of filling every available mental space, and my life was particularly full that week. When I wasn't at the hospital, I was catching up on sleep, grocery shopping at odd hours, or trying to maintain some semblance of a social life via text messages with friends who lived on a normal schedule. The mundane details of other people's lives, like a piece of lost laundry, held no importance and left no impression on my preoccupied mind. By the time the next Tuesday rolled around, I was bone-tired and desperately looking forward to my weekly ritual. The thought of the quiet hum of the machines and the solitary, focused task of doing my laundry felt like a beacon of peace at the end of a long, difficult tunnel. My laundry bag was overflowing with scrubs that smelled faintly of antiseptic and the sterile scent of the hospital. I was more than ready to wash the week away. As I walked through the dark, quiet streets towards the laundromat, I felt the familiar sense of decompression begin. The cool night air was a welcome change from the recycled, climate-controlled air of the hospital. The world was asleep, and for a little while, I could exist outside the constant demands of my job. I was not Nurse Alara, caregiver, and medical professional. I was just a woman, walking to a laundromat with a bag of dirty clothes. The spin cycle was exactly as I had left it, brightly lit, empty, and humming with its mechanical heartbeat. I felt a sense of relief as I stepped inside. This was my place, my predictable, unchanging sanctuary. I didn't spare a thought for the dryer with the red shirt from the week before. Why would I? It was a triviality, an event so minor it had failed to form a lasting memory. My mind was on my own tasks, my own ritual. I loaded my clothes into my usual machine, number 3, slid the coins home, and selected the cycle. The machine gurgled to life, the drum beginning to turn, the water beginning to slosh. I settled into the wobbly orange chair, pulled out my book, and prepared to lose myself in a fictional world for the next 30 minutes. The familiar sense of peace settled over me like a warm blanket. This was my time. The laundromat was a world unto itself, governed by its own simple rules. Water and soap make things clean. Heat makes them dry. It was a place of simple, satisfying physics. Its problems were mechanical and easily solved. A jammed coin slot, a machine that didn't spin. There was nothing psychological or ambiguous about it. It was a place of clear, tangible processes, which was perhaps why I found it so deeply comforting. I read a few chapters of my book. The words on the page, a welcome escape. The background noise of the washing machine was a familiar, lulling rhythm. I felt the tension in my shoulders, a constant companion from my work, begin to slowly unwind. This was the magic of the place. It was a forced meditation, a quiet moment of stillness carved out of the chaos of my nocturnal life. I felt my eyelids growing heavy. My sense of security was absolute. I was in a well-lit, public space, even if I was the only person in it. The large windows showed the empty street outside, a portrait of urban tranquility. There was nothing to fear here. The only ghosts in this place were the faint, soapy scents of the hundreds of strangers who had passed through before me, each leaving behind only the faintest trace of their existence before moving on. I was completely unaware that one of those traces, a small red piece of a stranger's life, had not moved on. I had forgotten about it, but it had not forgotten its place. It was waiting patiently in the dryer next to mine, a silent, persistent anomaly in my world of predictable routines. My peace was about to be disrupted by the simple, impossible fact of its continued existence. The first thread of a web was about to be pulled taut. The buzzer on the washing machine jolted me from my light doze. The first cycle was complete. I stretched, shaking off the pleasant grogginess, and gathered my wet clothes from machine number 3. I carried the heavy, damp bundle over to the bank of dryers on the opposite wall. As always, I aimed for dryer number 4, the one that ran a little hotter and finished 5 minutes faster than the others. It was a small, insignificant optimization, but it was part of my ritual. As I opened the door to my dryer, my eyes drifted to the one next to it, dryer number 5, and I froze. My hand, holding a tangled bundle of wet scrubs, stopped midair. Inside the large, dark drum of the neighboring dryer, lying in the exact same spot at the bottom, was the small red child's t-shirt. It hadn't moved. It was still there, a full week later. The sight was so unexpected, so wrong, that my brain took a long moment to process it. My first thought was one of simple disbelief. It couldn't be. Surely the place had been used, cleaned, attended to in the 7 days since I was last here. It was a busy laundromat. The idea that a single dryer would sit untouched for a whole week, with a piece of clothing inside it, seemed utterly impossible. I must be mistaken. Perhaps it was a different red shirt, left by a different forgetful parent just hours before I arrived. But I knew it wasn't. It was the same shirt, the same vibrant cherry red color, the same small size. It lay in the same sad, lonely heap in the bottom of the drum. A week of activity, of countless strangers coming and going, and this one small item had remained in its place, a fixed point in a world of constant motion. The coincidence was too great to be a coincidence. It was a statistical impossibility. Finished loading my own clothes into my dryer, my movements now automatic, my mind racing. I kept glancing at the red shirt in the neighboring machine. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the dryer was broken. That would explain why no one had used it. But there was no out-of-order sign taped to the glass, the usual method for signaling a faulty machine in a place like this. It was available, ready, and waiting. A new, more unsettling thought began to form. Maybe no one had taken the shirt because no one else could see it. The thought was absurd, a ridiculous leap into the realm of the supernatural, and I dismissed it almost as soon as it appeared. I was a nurse. I was a woman of science and evidence. There were no such things as phantom shirts. The explanation had to be a mundane one, however unlikely it seemed. I walked over to dryer number 5 and peered closer, my face just inches from the cool glass door. The shirt was made of a thin, cheap cotton. There was a small dark stain near the collar, like a drop of chocolate milk. The tag was faded and frayed. It was an ordinary, well-worn piece of clothing. It was undeniably real. My absurd fantasy of it being a ghostly apparition evaporated, leaving me with a much more concrete and somehow more unsettling reality. So, the shirt was real, and it had been sitting here for at least a week. The only logical conclusion was one of profound neglect. The owners or attendants of the spin cycle were simply not doing their jobs. They hadn't cleaned out the machines. It was a lazy, unprofessional oversight, but it was a logical one. This thought brought a small measure of comfort, and I clung to it. It was a simple, boring explanation, and I desperately wanted it to be true. But even as I tried to reassure myself, a part of my mind rejected the explanation. This was a 24-hour business in a busy part of the city. The turnover for these machines had to be immense. The idea that one would sit, not just unused, but entirely unopened for a full week, felt deeply wrong. Someone, an employee or another, customer, would have surely opened it, if only out of curiosity or to use the machine themselves. The red t-shirt was no longer an innocent, forgotten item. It was an anomaly. It was a question mark hanging in the air of my quiet, predictable sanctuary. Its continued, impossible presence had transformed it from a piece of lost laundry into something else. It was a silent sentinel, a quiet observer. It was waiting. And its presence had subtly altered the atmosphere of the room. The laundromat no longer felt entirely anonymous. It felt like a space that was being watched. I finished my laundry with a new, hurried sense of purpose. I didn't read my book. I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting back to dryer number 5, to the small, silent splash of red behind the glass. Every so often, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, I thought I saw it move, a slight shift in its position, but I knew it was just a trick of the light. my own frayed nerves projecting motion where there was none. The room felt charged with a new, tense energy. As I folded my warm clothes on the long table, I was acutely aware of the shirt. It felt like an eye, a single red eye watching me from the darkness of the metal drum. My movements felt self-conscious, observed. The laundromat was no longer my private sanctuary. It was a shared space now, shared with this one, persistent, silent object. The anonymity of the place had been completely shattered by a single, inexplicable piece of cotton. I felt a bizarre and powerful urge to open the dryer door. I wanted to reach in, to touch the shirt, to prove to myself that it was just a normal piece of fabric. I imagined taking it out, folding it neatly, and leaving it on the table for the owners to find in the morning. A simple, helpful gesture. But a strange, paralyzing fear held me back. To touch it felt like accepting a dare, like engaging in a conversation I did not want to be a part of. So I did nothing. I left it there, a silent testament in its glass and metal tomb. I packed my bag, my heart thumping with a low, steady rhythm of anxiety. As I pushed open the laundromat's glass door to leave, I took one last look over my shoulder. The red shirt was there, a fixed point in the room, waiting patiently. It felt like it was watching me go, secure in the knowledge that I would be back. Walk home was different tonight. I was not calm or decompressed. I was wired, hyper-alert. Every shadow on the street seemed to stretch a little longer. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a footstep behind me. The mundane world had taken on a sinister edge. The strangeness of the laundromat was seeping out, staining the edges of my reality. The image of the red shirt was burned into my mind. I got back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. The slide of the deadbolt a small, reassuring sound. But the feeling of being watched did not dissipate. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The anomaly was contained to the laundromat, yes, but it had planted a seed of fear in my mind, a seed that I had now brought back into my own home. I found myself checking the locks twice, peering out my window at the empty street below. That night, sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of endless rows of humming dryers, each with a single red t-shirt tumbling slowly inside. I dreamt of a small, chocolate milk-stained hand waving to me from behind the glass. I woke up several times, my heart racing, the scent of warm, cotton and stale air from the laundromat still clinging to my senses. The incident had burrowed deep into my subconscious. By the time the sun rose, a new resolve had formed. My fear was still there, but it was now mingled with a defiant, angry curiosity. I would not be driven from my routine by this. I would not let a piece of misplaced clothing unravel my sanity. I would go back next Tuesday at the same time, and I would see if the shirt was still there. And if it was, I would do something. I would take it out. I would take it to the police. I would do something. I was no longer a passive observer. The entity, whatever it was, had my full attention. It had established a pattern, and I was now a willing participant in its strange, silent game. My weekly laundry trip was no longer a mundane chore. It was an appointment. An appointment with an inexplicable, unsettling mystery that was waiting for me in dryer number 5. The apathetic neglect of the owners was no longer a plausible explanation. This was something else. This was deliberate. The shirt was a marker, a signpost. It was a message, and I was the intended recipient. I didn't know what the message was, or who was sending it, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I was meant to see it. The game had begun. The week leading up to my next laundry night was a tightrope walk between obsessive fear and determined skepticism. During the day, in the bright, logical world of the hospital, I would convince myself that I was overreacting. It was just a shirt, a forgotten, insignificant piece of clothing. My mind, tired from my demanding schedule, had simply inflated a coincidence into a conspiracy. I was being foolish. But at night, in the quiet of my apartment, the fear would return. A cold and heavy certainty that I was not foolish at all. Arrived at the spin cycle the following Tuesday with a sense of grim purpose. I was not here for the peaceful ritual of cleaning my clothes. I was here for an investigation. My laundry bag felt lighter than the heavy weight of dread in my stomach. As I pushed open the glass door, my eyes immediately darted to the bank of dryers, to number 5. My breath caught in my throat. I was prepared for anything. For the shirt to be there, for it to be gone, for it to be replaced by something else. The dryer was empty. The small red t-shirt was gone. The large metal drum was now a vacant gray void. A wave of confusing, dizzying relief washed over me. So that was it. It had been cleaned out. The owners had finally done their job. The mystery was over. I felt a fool for all the anxiety I had put myself through, for the sleepless nights and the paranoid thoughts. It had all been nothing, just a simple case of a neglected machine. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, a shaky laugh escaping my lips. I felt lighter. The oppressive atmosphere of the laundromat seemed to lift instantly. It was just a normal place again, a room full of humming machines. I had been so wrong, so quick to jump to terrifying conclusions. I shook my head at my own foolishness and turned to get on with my task, feeling the sweet relief of a crisis averted. I walked over to my usual washing machine, number 3, and began to load my clothes. But as I worked, a strange feeling began to creep over me. A sense of wrongness that I couldn't immediately place. It was the feeling you get when you walk into a familiar room and a single piece of furniture has been moved. Everything looks normal, but your subconscious knows something is out of place. I paused, my hands full of scrubs, and scanned the room. And then I saw it. It was on the chair. My chair. The wobbly orange plastic chair that I always sat in. The one directly under the light that didn't flicker. Lying neatly in the center of the seat, as if placed there for my inspection, was a single dark object. It was a man's glove. A worn brown leather glove, creased and stained with age and use. It was curled slightly, as if it still held the shape of the hand that had once worn it. The air left my lungs in a rush. This was not possible. The laundromat was empty when I arrived. I had been here for less than 5 minutes. The glove was not there when I walked in. I would have seen it. But it was there now, placed with a quiet, deliberate precision in the one spot in this entire room that was uniquely, personally mine. The red shirt had been an anomaly. This was a message. The relief I had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a fear so cold and so absolute it felt like a physical blow. The shirt being gone was not the end of the game. It was the next move. It was a clearing of the board for a new piece to be played. And this new piece was infinitely more personal, more direct. It was an item that could only have been left for me. It was a clear and undeniable sign that I was being watched. My heart hammered against my ribs. I backed away from the chair, my eyes locked on the glove. It seemed to possess a horrifying significance. a weight far beyond its simple physical form. It was an adult's item, a man's item. The vague image of a forgetful mother was replaced by a much more sinister, faceless figure. A man who knew my habits. A man who knew where I sat. A man who could enter and leave this space without making a sound. He had been here. He had been here just moments ago. Or perhaps he was here now, watching me from some hidden corner, some dark shadow that the fluorescent lights could not reach. The laundromat, my sanctuary, was no longer safe. It was his space now. He had demonstrated that he could not only leave objects for me to find, but he could place them in my personal space, a violation of an unspoken boundary that left me feeling naked and exposed. I abandoned my laundry. The half-loaded washing machine, the bag of dirty clothes on the floor. None of it mattered anymore. My only instinct was to flee. This place was contaminated, a stage for a performance I had no desire to witness. The mundane, comforting sounds of the laundromat, the humming and whirring, now seemed menacing, a soundtrack to my own private horror film. I felt a desperate, primal need to get back to the safety of my own apartment, to lock the door behind me. I gathered my purse and my keys, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I refused to touch the glove. I refused to even look at it for too long. To acknowledge it further felt like playing into his hands, like admitting I had received his message. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen it, to give the illusion of ignorance, even though my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm of terror against my ribs. I just needed to get out. Now. As I turned towards the exit, my eyes caught my own reflection in the large plate glass door. I saw a pale, terrified-looking woman, her eyes wide, her posture tense. The laundromat was bright behind me, the row of silent dryers stretching out like a distorted hall of mirrors. The street outside was dark and empty. It was just me. But for a single heart-stopping instant, as the fluorescent lights above me gave a low, buzzing flicker, the reflection changed. For a fraction of a second, another face was superimposed over my own in the glass. It was a man's face, gaunt and pale, with dark, hollow eyes. It was there for no longer than a single buzzing pulse of the lights, a fleeting subliminal image. It was not behind me in the laundromat, and it was not outside on the street. It was just there, in the glass, a phantom image that looked out at me with an expression of intense, unnerving focus, and then it was gone. I gasped, stumbling back, my hand flying to my mouth. I stared at the glass, but now all I saw was my own terrified reflection, my own wide eyes staring back at me. Had I imagined it? Was my mind, now primed for terror, simply creating monsters out of flickering lights and shadows? Or had I just seen him? Had I seen the face of the man who had left the glove? The man who was watching me? The ambiguity was a fresh wave of horror. I didn't wait for an answer. I shoved the glass door open and ran out into the cold night air, not looking back. I ran the 3 blocks back to my apartment building, my keys clutched in my hand like a weapon. The quiet, peaceful streets now felt menacing. Every dark doorway and shadowy tree a potential hiding place for the man with the hollow eyes. The world was no longer safe. The horror was no longer contained to the laundromat. I fumbled with the locks to my apartment, my hands shaking too badly to guide the key home. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming and locking it behind me, ramming the deadbolt home with a loud, final thud. I leaned against the door, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. I was home. I was safe. But I knew it was a lie. The feeling of being watched had followed me. It was inside my apartment now, a cold, invisible presence. I could feel his hollow eyes on me, even here. He had proven that he could get close to me, that he could leave me gifts, that he could watch me without being seen. And now, I had seen his face, if only for a terrifying, ghostly instant. He was no longer a vague, faceless threat. He had a form. I was in a new state of profound and unshakable paranoia. I was being stalked. A man, a real physical person, had chosen me as the object of his obsession. He knew my routine. He knew my habits. He knew where I went in the dead of night. The anonymous public space of the laundromat had been successfully converted into a private theater of terror, and I was its only audience member. The first act of this horrifying play was over. The subtle hints, the strange objects, the growing unease had all led to this. A direct, undeniable confirmation that I was in danger. The threat was real. It was human. And it now had a face, however fleetingly I had seen it. I huddled on my couch, the lights of my apartment blazing, and knew that my life would never be the same. The game had escalated, and I had no idea what the next move would be. The week that followed was lived on a knife's edge. The face in the reflection, real or imagined, haunted my every waking moment. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. My nights spent listening to the sounds of my own apartment building, flinching at every creak and groan. The image of the worn leather glove on my chair was a constant, intrusive thought. It was a symbol of my invaded solitude, a clear sign that my quiet, predictable world had been breached by an unknown, malevolent presence. My fear was a tangible thing now, a cold, heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. This was no longer about strange coincidences or misplaced items. This was about a person. A man who knew my routine so intimately that he knew which chair I preferred in an empty laundromat. He had moved from leaving clues to leaving calling cards. The thought made me feel physically ill. My sanctuary had become his playground, and I had been the unwilling playmate in his twisted game. I knew I couldn't go back. Not on Tuesday. To return at my usual time would be to walk willingly into an appointment I did not want to keep. It would be an act of surrender, a confirmation to him that his game was working. A stubborn, angry part of me bristled at the thought of letting this faceless man dictate my schedule, of letting him chase me from the one place I had found solace. But the fear was stronger than my pride. My routine was compromised. I had to break it. For the first time in years, I called my supervisor at the hospital and asked to switch my shifts. I claimed a family matter, a vague but plausible excuse. My goal was simple: to get a few days off during the week, to disrupt my nocturnal schedule so completely that I could go to the laundromat during daylight hours, surrounded by other people. I needed the shield of normalcy, the safety of a crowd, to feel brave enough to even approach the place again. My supervisor agreed, and for the rest of the week, I lived like a normal person. I slept at night and was awake during the day. The sunlight felt strange on my skin. The bustling noise of the city, a stark contrast to the quiet world I usually inhabited. It was a strange, disorienting experience. I felt like a tourist in my own life, a nocturnal creature forced into the harsh, unfamiliar light of day. But it was a necessary disorientation. It was a strategy. I decided to do my laundry on a Saturday afternoon. The thought of it filled me with a deep, churning anxiety. I considered going to a different laundromat, one further away, but the thought felt like a definitive act of defeat. The spin cycle was my territory. I refused to be chased out of it completely. I would go back, but I would go back on my own terms, in the bright, unforgiving light of day. When I arrived, the place was almost unrecognizable. It was filled with the noise and activity I had always avoided. Mothers were trying to wrangle small children. College students were loudly talking on their phones, and every machine was in use. The air was thick and humid, and the chaotic energy of it all was overwhelming. But with the chaos came a sense of security. There were people everywhere. There were witnesses. He wouldn't dare try anything now. I had to wait for a machine to become free, a novel experience for me. I stood in the corner, my laundry bag clutched in my hand, and scanned the faces of the other patrons. Was he one of them? Was he here now, hiding in plain sight, watching me? Every man I saw was a potential suspect. Every sideways glance a possible sign of his sinister attention. My paranoia was a colored lens through which I now saw the entire world. Finally, a machine opened up, and I quickly loaded my clothes. I didn't sit in my usual chair. It was occupied by a woman folding her towels. I stood by my machine, my back against the wall, observing the room, trying to appear casual. I checked the dryers. Number 5 was in use, its drum filled with a stranger's colorful clothes. The red shirt, the original sin of this whole nightmare, was gone. There was no glove, no out-of-place object anywhere. Everything was aggressively, chaotically normal. A small part of me began to relax. Maybe this was the solution. By changing my routine, by plunging myself into the anonymity of a crowd, I had broken his pattern. He was a creature of the night, a stalker who relied on solitude and silence. The bright, noisy chaos of a Saturday afternoon was not his hunting ground. I had outsmarted him. I had changed the rules of the game, and in doing so, I had taken back control. The rest of my time at the laundromat was blessedly, beautifully, mundane. I managed to secure a dryer, folded my clothes amidst the noisy chaos of other people's lives, and left without a single strange or unsettling incident. The experience was stressful in a normal way, too loud, too crowded, but it was a kind of stress I welcomed. It was the stress of the real, tangible world, not the silent, psychological stress of being haunted. The daylight and the crowd had been my shield. Walking home in the bright afternoon sun, I felt triumphant. My fear from the previous week seemed like a distant nightmare, a product of darkness and solitude. I had been a fool to think I was being targeted. It was probably just a series of bizarre coincidences, magnified by my own exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the laundromat at night. The man's face in the reflection, a trick of the light. The glove, a simple forgotten item. I had built a monster out of shadows. I felt a renewed sense of power. I had been scared, yes, but I had not allowed the fear to paralyze me. I had analyzed the situation, identified the variables, the time, the solitude, and I had changed them. I had solved the problem with logic. The world felt orderly and understandable again. The sense of being watched faded, replaced by the comforting anonymity of being just another face in the weekend crowd. My sanctuary was safe again. I just had to visit during normal hours. After my weekend of normalcy, I returned to my night shift schedule at the hospital. But I did so with a new plan, a new sense of control. I would no longer do my laundry on Tuesday nights after my shift. I would let it pile up during the week and continue to make my trips to the spin cycle on Saturday or Sunday afternoons. It was less convenient, certainly, but it was a small price to pay for my own peace of mind. The following week was peaceful. My shifts were demanding, but my nights at home were my own again. I no longer felt a sense of dread as Tuesday approached. I didn't spare a thought for the laundromat, for the red shirt, or for the leather glove. The memories were still there, but they were losing their power, becoming the story of a strange week I had once had. A story I would likely never tell anyone for fear of sounding insane. My fear had been a fever, and it felt like it had finally broken. I was sleeping better. I was more focused at work. The world no longer felt like a stage set for my own personal horror story. It was just the world again, indifferent and chaotic, but not malicious. I had successfully extricated myself from the strange web of events by simply refusing to participate in the game any longer. I had refused to show up for the appointment. My confidence grew with each passing day. I had faced down a profound and unsettling experience, and I had come out the other side stronger, more rational. I had let my imagination get the better of me, and I had corrected my own course. The pride in this was immense. I had been my own protector, my own savior. I had not needed the police or anyone else. I had simply needed to change my routine. This feeling of victory, of having outsmarted the shadows, was a deeply comforting one. It restored my faith in my own judgment, my own sanity. The world was a logical place, and even the strangest occurrences had simple, logical solutions. All I had needed to do was step out of the darkness and into the light. The monster, it turned out, was afraid of crowds and sunshine. But my victory was an illusion, built on a faulty premise. I had assumed that the entity, the man who was watching me, was bound by the same rules of time and place that I was. I believed that my presence was the trigger, and that by removing myself from the equation at that specific time, I had ended the experiment. I was a fool. I had not outsmarted him. I had only proven to him that I was paying attention. He knew my old routine, and he was about to prove that he knew my new one as well. He had let me have my small victory, my brief period of peace. He had allowed me to believe I was safe, to rebuild my sense of security, to lower my guard. He was patient, and he was waiting for the perfect moment to show me that changing my schedule was meaningless. He could play his game anytime, anywhere. And the next move would be undeniable. For nearly 2 weeks, my strategy held. I settled into my new routine, working my night shifts and saving my laundry for the bright, noisy chaos of the weekend. The fear began to feel like a distant memory, a strange, feverish dream I had once had. I started to sleep more soundly, the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who truly believes they are safe. My hypervigilance faded, replaced by my old, easygoing comfort. I had won. The spin cycle was just a laundromat again. The following Saturday, I went back with a sense of casual confidence. I hauled my laundry bag into the crowded, humid room without a second thought, my mind already on the errands I needed to run afterward. The place was a hive of normal life. The sounds were of crying children, laughing students, and the constant, reassuring rumble of the machines. There were no shadows here, no sinister whispers, no oppressive silence. This was my new, safe normal. Navigated the crowded room, heading for my preferred washing machine, number 3. I still felt a proprietary fondness for it, even during the busy daylight hours. It was a small, familiar comfort. As I approached, I saw that the machine was free. I smiled to myself, a small stroke of luck in a busy day. I dropped my heavy laundry bag on the floor in front of the machine, ready to begin the simple, mundane task. And then I saw it. Sitting on the floor, placed neatly and precisely against the front of my washing machine, was a single shoe. It was a child's sneaker, a small scuffed white shoe with a strip of blue Velcro across the top. It was placed so deliberately, so perfectly centered in front of the machine, that it could not have been accidentally dropped. It looked like an exhibit in a museum, an object placed on display. My object. My blood ran cold. The noisy, chaotic laundromat seemed to fade away, the sounds of crying children and humming machines dissolving into a dull, distant roar. My entire universe narrowed to that one impossible object. A child's shoe. Here. Now. On my new safe day. At my new safe time, placed directly at the foot of the one machine in this entire room that I always used. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a response. He knew. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He knew I had changed my schedule. He knew. I was coming here on Saturdays now, and he knew which machine I used. The level of observation required for that knowledge was terrifying. It meant he hadn't just been watching the laundromat at night. He had been studying me for a long time, cataloging my habits, my preferences, my every small, insignificant choice. The false sense of security I had so carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks shattered into a million pieces. My brilliant strategy, my change in routine, had been a joke to him. It hadn't thrown him off at all. It had only confirmed to him that I was a player in his game, that I was reacting to his moves. He had let me think I was safe, had given me just enough time to lower my guard before making this move. This was a declaration. It was a message that said, "You cannot hide from me. I see you, Alara. I see you on Tuesday nights, and I see you on Saturday afternoons. I know which chair you sit in, and I know which machine you use. Changing your routine is meaningless. I am always watching." The shoe was not a random item. It was a symbol of his omniscience, his complete and utter control over my life. I felt a wave of nausea, my knees suddenly weak. I looked around the crowded room, but the faces of the strangers offered no comfort. He could be any one of them. He could be the man reading a newspaper in the corner, the college student listening to music, the father trying to soothe his crying child. Or he could not be here at all. He could have left the shoe 5 minutes before I arrived, knowing I was on my way. The second possibility was somehow even more terrifying. My carefully constructed defense had been annihilated. I had not outsmarted him. I had only revealed my methods to him. I had shown him that I was afraid, and I had shown him what I would do to try and feel safe. And he had used that knowledge to craft this new, more personal, more devastating violation. The game had not ended. He had just patiently waited for me to make my move, and now he was making his. I stood there for a long moment, frozen in the middle of the bustling room, my bag of dirty laundry feeling impossibly heavy at my feet. The sounds of the laundromat, which had been a comforting chaos moments before, now felt grating and hostile. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't perform the mundane task of washing my clothes while this screaming, silent proof of my surveillance sat on the floor in front of me. To continue my routine would be an act of madness, a normalization of a situation that was anything but normal. Without a word, without even looking at anyone else, I picked up my laundry bag and walked out. I left the shoe where it sat, a small, white monument to my terror. Leaving the laundromat felt like a retreat from a battlefield, a tactical surrender. The bright afternoon sun did nothing to dispel the icy chill that had settled deep in my bones. He had won this round completely. He had proven his point with devastating, simple, and silent efficiency. The walk home was a paranoid nightmare. Every person I passed on the street was a potential suspect. Every car that slowed down was a potential observer. The world was no longer a collection of strangers. It was a sea of potential threats, and I was the only one who knew the danger. I was in. My anonymity, the shield I had always worn in the city, had been stolen from me. I felt singled out, marked, a target walking in plain sight. Back in my apartment, I locked and deadbolted the door, but it brought no comfort. The lock felt like a flimsy, pathetic gesture. He knew where I did my laundry. He knew my schedule. He knew my habits. What else did he know? Did he know where I worked? Did he know which apartment was mine? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. The circle of his knowledge was tightening around me, and my world was shrinking with it. I thought back on the items. The red shirt, the man's glove, the child's shoe. It was a bizarre and unsettling collection. They were like clues in a scavenger hunt where I didn't know the rules. They were so random, yet their placement had been so specific. It was a performance, a piece of strange, silent theater, and he was the stage manager, the props master, and the unseen director. And I was his unwilling, terrified star. I realized then that this was not just about scaring me. It was about communicating with me. Each object was a word, a sentence in a language I didn't understand. He was telling me a story about a child, a man, a loss. Or perhaps he was just showing me the pieces he had collected, trophies from other lives, other games. The ambiguity was a form of torture in itself. The not knowing was becoming as frightening as the events themselves. My one and only strategy, to change my routine, was now useless. It had been a flimsy shield against a phantom, and the phantom had just walked right through it. I had no other ideas. What could I do? Stop doing laundry altogether? Move to a new apartment? A new city? The thought was overwhelming. To be forced from my home, from my life, by this silent, relentless pressure felt like a kind of death. The feeling of being toyed with was the worst part. This wasn't a simple stalker, shadowing my movements from a distance. This was an intelligence that was actively engaging with me, that was enjoying my reactions. He had seen my fear. He had seen my attempt to fight back, and he had found it amusing. He had let me have my moment of false victory, only to snatch it away in the most condescending way possible. I was no longer just being watched. I was being played with. My life had become a game board, and he was moving the pieces. I was not a person to him. I was a subject in an experiment, a puzzle to be solved, a thing to be manipulated. The depersonalization of it, the cold, calculating nature of the harassment, was profoundly chilling. It was a level of psychological warfare that I was completely unequipped to handle. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in my darkened living room, staring at the door, my mind a maelstrom of fear and helplessness. I had no moves left to make. He had countered my only defense with an attack that was more personal, more invasive than anything that had come before. I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the gifts would continue, and I knew that they would only get worse. The game was far from over. The following days were a study in paranoia. Every public space felt hostile, every stranger a potential threat. I started taking different routes to work, my head on a constant swivel, my eyes scanning reflections in shop windows. The feeling of being watched was a physical weight, a pressure at the back of my neck that never truly went away. My home was my only sanctuary. But even there, I felt like a prisoner, hiding from a world that was no longer safe for me. My carefully constructed life was unraveling. I was barely sleeping, existing on a diet of caffeine and anxiety. At work, my hands would tremble when I was drawing blood, and I would have to pause to steady my nerves. My colleagues noticed the change. They saw the dark circles under my eyes, the new, haunted look I wore like a second skin. They asked if I was okay, their faces etched with a professional, clinical concern that I found deeply alienating. I knew I couldn't continue to bear this alone. The fear was a poison, and keeping it inside was only making it more potent. I needed an antidote. I needed to tell someone. I needed another person to look at the facts and confirm that I was not going crazy, that what was happening to me was real and terrifying. I decided to confide in my friend and colleague, a fellow nurse named Maria. She was pragmatic, level-headed, and had a no-nonsense attitude that I desperately needed. I asked her to get coffee with me before our shift one night. We found a quiet corner in the hospital cafeteria, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. My hands shook as I held my cup. I tried to lay out the story for her logically, just as I had experienced it. I started with the red shirt, the simple, strange anomaly that had begun this whole nightmare. I watched her face carefully as I spoke, praying for a flicker of understanding. I told her about the glove on my chair, the impossible specificity of its placement. I described my failed attempt to change my routine and the crushing discovery of the child's shoe right in front of my machine. I explained that it wasn't just the objects themselves, but the pattern, the intelligence behind it, the feeling of being studied, of being toyed with by an unseen, unknown person. I laid my fear out for her like a patient chart, detailing the symptoms of my haunting. Maria listened patiently, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, stirring her coffee with a small plastic stick. "Ilara," she began, her voice soft, "and careful, you've been working double shifts for 3 weeks straight. You're exhausted. Are you sure you're not just reading into things a little too much?" It was the response I had been dreading, the gentle, caring dismissal that hurt more than any outright mockery could. "It's not in my head, Maria," I insisted, my voice gaining a desperate edge. The shoe was there. The glove was there. This isn't about being tired. This is about someone actively messing with me. I could hear how I sounded, frantic, paranoid, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed her to believe me, to validate my fear. I needed her to see the monster that I saw. Okay, she said, raising a hand to calm me. "So let's think about it logically. A laundromat is a public place. People forget things all the time. A kid loses a shoe, a guy drops a glove. It's weird that it happened in your spot, I'll give you that. But it's probably just a really, really strange coincidence. You know, like winning the lottery, but a creepy, useless version of it. She was trying to make a joke, to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. Her rationalizations were a wall I couldn't seem to break through. To her, these were just a series of unfortunate, disconnected events. A lost and found bin come to life. She couldn't see the intelligence, the pattern, the deliberate, escalating nature of it all. In her world, the world of logic and reason, my story didn't make sense. And so, the story had to be wrong, not the world. Therefore, I had to be the one who was wrong. I considered telling her about the face in the reflection, the most direct and terrifying part of the experience. But I stopped myself. If she couldn't believe in a series of staged objects, how could she possibly believe in a ghostly face that appeared for a split second in a pane of glass? It would only confirm her fears that I was cracking under the pressure, that my mind was creating phantoms out of stress and sleep deprivation. By withholding that final, crucial detail, I was already beginning to censor my own story, to make it more palatable for the sane world. But this censorship was also a form of isolation. I was curating my own experience, cutting out the parts that were too unbelievable. And in doing so, I was invalidating my own terror. I was siding with the skeptics against myself, a desperate act of self-preservation that felt like a betrayal. The conversation ended with Maria making me promise to try and get more sleep, to maybe take a vacation day. Her advice was well-intentioned, the loving concern of a good friend. But it was also a complete and utter dismissal of my reality. She couldn't help me fight the monster because she didn't believe the monster was real. She believed the monster was me, a phantom created by an overworked and exhausted mind. I left the cafeteria feeling lonelier than I had before I arrived. Walking back to my unit, I felt the walls of my world closing in. The one person I thought I could count on for support had reinforced the most terrifying possibility, that I was the unreliable narrator of my own life. What other options did I have? Call the police? I played the conversation out in my head. Hello, officer. Someone left a glove on a chair, and then a shoe a week later. I feel like I'm being watched. I would be laughed off the phone, or worse, flagged as an unstable person in their system. There was no crime. There was no proof. There was only a collection of mundane objects in a public place and a feeling. But the feeling was everything. The feeling was the entire story. It was the cold dread in the pit of my stomach, the certainty of a malevolent intelligence behind the events. But feelings are not evidence. My fear was inadmissible in the court of law and in the court of public opinion. I had nothing, so I was truly, completely on my own. My stalker, my tormentor, had chosen the perfect method of harassment. It was a campaign of psychological terror waged with the most banal and untraceable of weapons: a lost t-shirt, a dropped glove, a child's shoe. Each item on its own was meaningless. But together, they formed a mosaic of intimidation, a picture that only I could see clearly. The laundromat now loomed in my mind not as a real place, but as a recurring nightmare. The thought of going back filled me with a paralyzing dread. But I had to. My laundry was piling up. It was a simple, practical necessity. My tormentor knew this. He had cleverly woven his game into the fabric of my routine, into a chore I could not avoid. He had turned a necessity of my life into a stage for his horror. My isolation was now a key feature of the game. He had successfully cut me off from my support system. He had made me sound crazy to my friends and had made me too scared to call the authorities. It was just me and him now, a silent, one-on-one battle of wills. And he had all the power. He was the one who knew the rules, the one who set the stage, the one who decided when and how the next move would be made. I spent the next few days in a fog of helpless dread, waiting for the next laundry day to arrive. As one might wait for a scheduled execution, my fear was no longer just about the strange events themselves, but about my own dwindling sanity. Maria's words echoed in my head. Was I just tired? Was I connecting dots that weren't there? The entity wasn't just making me afraid of him. He was making me afraid of myself. This, I realized, was his true genius. He was attacking my credibility, not just to the outside world, but to myself. By making the harassment so subtle and so bizarre, he was forcing me to question the validity of my own perceptions. The greatest weapon in his arsenal was my own self-doubt. He was a gaslighter of the highest order, and I was his sole, captive audience. And so I waited. I let my laundry bag fill up, a canvas sack of dread sitting in the corner of my bedroom. I knew I had to go back. I had no other choice. And I knew that he would be waiting. He would have a new gift for me, a new, more personal violation. The game had to continue, and I, his unwilling opponent, had no choice but to show up and play my part. The following week, my laundry bag sat in the corner of my room like an unexploded bomb. Each day it grew fuller, a physical manifestation of my growing dread. I had no choice. My scrubs were piling up, and the simple, practical need to have clean clothes was forcing my hand. My tormentor had been clever, weaving his game into the unbreakable cycle of my life's necessities. To live, I had to work. To work, I needed clean scrubs. And to get clean scrubs, I had to return to his playground. I decided to go back to my original routine. Tuesday night. The idea of returning on a busy Saturday, of trying to pretend things were normal among a crowd of strangers, now seemed impossible. The shoe had proven that the daylight offered no protection. The crowd offered no anonymity. My fear was not situational anymore. It was constant. If I was going to be terrified, I might as well be terrified on my own schedule, in the solitude I once cherished. My walk to the spin cycle that night was a funereal procession. Every step felt heavy, fated. The streets were empty and silent, and I felt a profound sense of isolation, of walking toward a confrontation that no one else in the world knew was happening. I clutched the strap of my laundry bag, my knuckles white. I was not the same person who had walked this path a month ago. I was a soldier returning to a battlefield, and I was not at all sure I would survive the night. The laundromat was exactly as it always was late at night, brightly lit, humming, and completely empty. The familiarity brought no comfort. Instead, it felt like a stage, perfectly set for my arrival. I pushed the door open, the small bell above it giving a cheerful, mocking jingle. My eyes immediately scanned the room. The orange chair was empty. There was nothing in front of machine number 3. For a brief, insane moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he had gotten bored. Maybe the game was over. But I knew better. This was his pattern. He let me feel a moment of relief before revealing the next move. I was on high alert, my senses screaming. I walked cautiously into the room, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum. I surveyed every corner, every shadow. every machine. The place was clean, sterile, and empty. There were no shirts in the dryers, no gloves on the chairs. Nothing was out of place. This absence of a clear threat was, in itself, terrifying. I began my laundry ritual, my movements stiff and robotic. I loaded the machine, my hands shaking as I poured in the detergent. The mundane actions felt absurd under the weight of my fear. I was just a woman doing her laundry, yet I felt as if I were a bomb disposal expert, unsure which move would trigger the detonation. I sat down in my usual chair, but I didn't open my book. My eyes were constantly scanning the room, watching the door, watching the reflections in the dark glass of the machines. The wash cycle finished. The silence between the end of the wash and the start of the dry was always the most profound. Tonight, it was deafening. I stood up and moved towards the dryers, my body tense. As I was transferring the wet clothes from the washer to the dryer, a single bright pink sock slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor, landing partially under the machine next to mine, a simple, clumsy mistake. I sighed, a sound of pure frustration, and knelt to retrieve it. The floor was surprisingly grimy under the lip of the machine, a place the nightly mopping didn't quite reach. I reached my hand into the dusty space, my fingers searching for the damp fabric of the sock. Instead, my fingers brushed against something, stiff, flat, and square. It was a piece of cardboard, or something like it. My heart began to pound. Curiosity, that fatal human impulse, overrode my fear. I hooked my finger around the object and carefully slid it out from under the machine. It wasn't cardboard, it was a photograph. A single old-fashioned Polaroid photograph, its white border smudged with the grime from the floor. It was placed face down. I knelt there for a long moment, the damp sock forgotten, staring at the blank white square in my hand. I knew with a certainty that made me feel sick that this was the next gift. This was the next move in the game. A part of me screamed to just leave it, to get up and run, to not look at the image on the other side. But I couldn't. I had to know. My whole ordeal, my entire psychological siege, had been leading to this moment. With a trembling hand, I turned the photograph over and looked at the image that had been waiting for me in the darkness. The image was of me. It was a grainy, slightly blurred photograph, taken through the large plate glass window of the laundromat, looking in from the darkness outside. I was sitting in my usual orange chair, under the non-flickering light, my head bent over a book. My expression in the photo was one of calm, placid concentration. I looked peaceful. I looked completely, blissfully unaware that I was being watched, that my image was being captured by a predator in the night. A wave of vertigo washed over me, and I had to place a hand on the cold metal of the machine to steady myself. My own face stared back at me, a ghost from a few weeks ago, a version of myself that could still find peace in this room. The man who had taken this picture had been standing out there, in the dark, just a few feet away, hidden from my view. He had watched me read. He had watched me, and he had captured me, preserving a moment of my stolen solitude. This was a violation of a different magnitude. The shirt, the glove, the shoe, they were unsettling, objects left in my path. But this was a piece of me. He had taken my image, my likeness, without my consent. He had turned me from a person into an object, a subject to be documented. The photograph felt like a piece of my soul that had been ripped away and was now being shown to me, a trophy of his successful hunt. I scrambled to my feet, the photograph clutched in my hand, the fallen sock completely forgotten. My laundry, tumbling in the dryer, was no longer important. Nothing was important except for escape. The brightly lit laundromat, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a well-lit stage where I was the unwilling star of a show I never auditioned for. The glass windows were no longer a shield. They were a vulnerability, an open invitation for unseen eyes. I ran. I didn't gather my things. I didn't wait for my clothes to dry. I left my laundry bag, my book, everything. I shoved the glass door open and sprinted out into the night, the Polaroid held tight in my fist. The cold night air felt different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the presence of the man who had stood in these shadows and watched me. Every dark alley, every unlit doorway was a place where he could be standing right now, watching me flee. I didn't stop running until I was inside my apartment building, frantically pushing the button for the elevator. As I rode up, I stared at the photograph again under the dim, flickering light of the elevator car. I could see the title of the book I was reading in the picture. He had been that close. He had been close enough to read the words on the cover of my book. The intimacy of the violation was sickening. I burst into my apartment and slammed the door, ramming the deadbolt home and, for the first time, fastening the small security chain. It was a pathetic, flimsy piece of metal, but it was the only thing I had. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the door, and finally let out the scream that had been building in my throat, a sound of pure, helpless terror. He had a piece of me now. He had proof of his obsession. The game had escalated to a terrifying new level. The gifts were no longer just symbolic. He was now showing me his evidence. He was showing me his collection. And I was the centerpiece of it. The photograph was a promise. It was a threat. It was a clear, undeniable message that said, I can get this close to you whenever I want. I can see you even when you can't see me. I own these moments of your life. All my attempts to fight back, to change my routine, to rationalize the events, they were all a joke. He was always one step ahead, watching my every move, documenting my every reaction. My life was a Truman Show of terror, and he was the obsessive, unseen director. I was completely, utterly, and hopelessly at his mercy. My isolation was absolute, not just from the world, but from my own sense of self. I was left with the horrifying, undeniable proof that my safe spaces were gone. The laundromat was his. The streets were his. And the image of me, peaceful and unaware, was his. I was a character in his story, a butterfly pinned to a board. The despair was total. The game was no longer about whether I could escape his notice. The only question left was what he planned to do now that he had finished. Taking my picture? The photograph sat on my kitchen table, a square of glossy poison. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was the only piece of tangible evidence I had, the only proof that the horrors of the past month were not a figment of my sleep-deprived imagination. I would stare at it for long stretches of time, at the image of the unsuspecting woman reading her book, and I would feel a profound and complete disconnect from her. She was a different person, someone who still believed in safe spaces. She was a ghost. For days, I lived in a self-imposed prison. I called in sick to work, claiming a sudden flu. The thought of leaving my apartment, of stepping out into a world where he could be watching, was paralyzing. I kept the blinds drawn, the doors locked, the chain on. I ordered groceries to be delivered, my only interaction with the outside world, a brief, furtive exchange at my front door. My home had become a bunker, and I was its sole, terrified occupant. But the fear, as all-consuming as it was, could not burn forever. As the days wore on, something else began to stir in the ashes of my terror. It was a cold, quiet, and deeply unfamiliar feeling. It was rage, a pure, undiluted fury at this man, this phantom who had so systematically dismantled my life, my peace, my very sense of self. He had taken my sanctuary and turned it into a torture chamber. He had taken my solitude and turned it into a surveillance state. This anger was a clarifying fire. It burned away the helpless despair, leaving behind a hard, sharp resolve. I was done hiding. I was done being afraid. Hiding was a losing game. He had already proven he could find me anywhere. Running was not an option. He would just follow. My passive, reactive strategies had all failed spectacularly. There was only one option left. I had to stop being the prey. I had to become the hunter. The decision, once made, felt like a tectonic shift in my soul. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow to fall. I was an active participant, a player who was about to make her own move. The fear didn't vanish, but it changed its shape. It was no longer a weight that held me down. It was a whetstone, sharpening my senses, focusing my mind. I was going to go back to the spin cycle one last time, but it would be on my terms. I began to plan with the same methodical focus I usually reserved for my nursing charts. I analyzed my enemy. He was patient. He was intelligent. He enjoyed the psychological game. His weakness, I realized, was his arrogance. He believed he was in complete control. He believed I was a frightened, predictable creature of habit. He would expect me to run, to hide, to eventually break. He would not expect me to fight back. My plan was not to trap him in the conventional sense. I couldn't. I had no idea what he looked like, beyond the fleeting, ghostly image in the glass. I had no way to identify him. My goal was simpler and more direct. I was going to force a confrontation. I was going to create a situation so public, so undeniable, that he could not simply slip away into the shadows. I was going to turn his own stage against him. I went to an electronics store, my first trip out of my apartment in nearly a week. I felt a new sense of purpose, a dangerous energy humming in my veins. I didn't buy a weapon. I bought a set of high-decibel personal safety alarms, the kind that emit a piercing, ear-splitting shriek when a pin is pulled. I also bought a small, powerful flashlight with a strobe function designed to disorient an attacker. I was building an arsenal, not of violence, but of noise and light. My laundry bag, which had sat untouched, became part of my plan. I filled it not just with my dirty clothes, but with my new tools. I also packed a can of spray paint. The plan was simple. I would go to the laundromat. I would wait for him to make his move, to leave his next gift. And when he did, I would not run. I would pull every alarm, I would activate the strobe light, and I would spray paint the windows, trapping us both inside in a storm of light and sound. It was a suicidal plan, a desperate gambit. But it was my plan. It was an act of taking back control in the only way I knew how. I was no longer just a pawn in his game. I was flipping the board over. I would create a scene so loud, so chaotic, that the outside world, the world that had refused to believe me, would have no choice but to look. They would have no choice but to see us both. I waited for Tuesday. The days passed in a strange, heightened state of awareness. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but the rage was a shield against it. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I was no longer a ship adrift in a storm of unexplained events. I had a destination. I had a purpose. It was a terrifying purpose, but it was mine, and the ownership of it gave me a strange, grim strength. On Tuesday night, I got ready for my appointment. I dressed in dark, practical clothes. I checked the alarms, pulling the pin on one just for a second, the resulting shriek so loud it made my ears ring. It was a beautiful, ugly sound. I packed my laundry bag, the can of spray paint, and the alarms, nestled between my scrubs and my jeans. The bag felt heavy, weighted with my intent. I was ready. My walk to the laundromat felt like a scene from a movie. The city was asleep, the streetlights casting long, lonely pools of light on the empty sidewalks, but I was not a frightened victim scurrying through the shadows tonight. I walked with a steady, determined pace. My senses were on fire. I was aware of every sound, every flicker of movement. I was not just looking for threats. I was looking for him. The familiar, bright glow of the spin cycle appeared at the end of the street. It no longer looked like a beacon of safety, nor did it look like a place of terror. It looked like a stage, an arena, a place where this silent, one-sided war was about to become very, very loud. My heart was pounding, but it was not just with fear. It was with the thrilling, terrifying anticipation of a confrontation that I was now initiating. I paused across the street, observing the laundromat from the shadows. It was empty, just as I knew it would be. The rows of machines sat silent and waiting under the buzzing fluorescent lights. It was the same scene as always, but the context had completely changed. Before, I had been the mouse entering the maze. Tonight, I was the one who had designed the trap. I was bringing the chaos with me. I took a deep breath, the cool night air steadying my nerves. I thought about turning back, about abandoning this insane, suicidal plan. I could move. I could change my name. I could try to disappear. But I knew it would be useless. He would find me. A man this obsessive, this patient, would not be deterred by a change of address. The only way to end this was to confront it head-on, to break the game itself. I crossed the street, my footsteps the only sound in the quiet night. I pushed open the glass door, the cheerful little bell announcing my arrival. I stepped inside, the warm, familiar smell of detergent washing over me. The place was exactly as I had left it on that terrible night. My book was still sitting on the orange chair. My laundry was still in the dryer, the cycle long since finished. He had left everything as it was, a perfectly preserved crime scene. The sight of my abandoned belongings sent a fresh surge of anger through me. This was my space, my life, and he had turned it into his personal art installation of terror. My resolve hardened into a diamond-hard point. I would not be intimidated. I would not be chased away again. Tonight, this story would have a different ending. I would write it myself, in spray paint and shrieking alarms. I walked to the center of the room and dropped my bag on the floor. I didn't start my laundry. I just stood there, waiting. My presence here, at this time, after the events of the last visit, was a direct challenge. It was a move in the game, a signal that I was ready for the next round. I was making myself the bait, a willing sacrifice to draw the monster out into the open. I stood there, my hand in my bag, my fingers wrapped around the cool metal pin of the first alarm. The laundromat was silent except for the low hum of the lights. The silence was a coiled snake, ready to strike. But for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid of the silence. I was not afraid of the sound that might break it. I was the one who was going to make the noise now, and I was ready. I stood in the center of the laundromat for what felt like an hour, a statue of defiant terror. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. My hand was cramping from gripping the alarm pin in my bag. I was a coiled spring, ready to erupt into noise and chaos at the slightest provocation. But nothing happened. The room remained still, empty, and silent. He was changing the game, refusing to make a move while I was so obviously prepared for one. A slow, creeping doubt began to eat at my resolve. What if he wasn't coming tonight? What if he knew my plan? What if he was watching me right now from some dark corner, enjoying my futile, impotent rage? The thought that he was denying me the confrontation I had so desperately prepared for was a new kind of psychological torture. He was letting me stand in my own trap until my anger and adrenaline burned away, leaving only the familiar, bitter ashes of fear. Defeated, I finally moved. I couldn't stand there all night. I walked over to the orange chair and picked up my book, which lay where I had dropped it a week ago. As I lifted it, I saw that something was tucked inside the pages, marking the chapter I had been reading. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly into a small square. It was not mine. My blood ran cold. He had been here. He had touched my book. He had left me a new message. My hands trembled as I took the folded paper. It was old, yellowed, and brittle, the creases sharp and deep. It felt like a relic from another time. I slowly, carefully unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping, cut crudely from its original page. The headline was stark and faded: "Local man arrested for loitering harassment." The article was from 7 years ago. It was accompanied by a grainy black and white mugshot of a man with hollow eyes and a gaunt, haunted face. It was him. It was the face I had seen in the reflection in the glass door. The same empty, sorrowful eyes, the same gaunt cheeks. My mind reeled. He wasn't just showing me a random object this time. He was showing me himself. He was giving me his identity, his history. This was a confession. This was an introduction. And it was the most terrifying move he had made yet. I devoured the words of the article, my eyes flying across the faded print. The man's name was Arthur Penn. He was a local resident who had been arrested multiple times for causing disturbances at public places, parks, libraries, and most frequently 24-hour laundromats. He never harmed anyone. He would simply watch people, sometimes for hours, and occasionally he would steal a small, seemingly insignificant item: a child's hair ribbon, a single glove, a misplaced photograph. The article detailed his tragic backstory. Arthur Penn had lost his 8-year-old son Daniel years earlier in a hit-and-run accident. The boy had been holding a small red t-shirt he had just gotten for his birthday when it happened. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Penn's grief had curdled into a strange, obsessive disorder. He became a ghost, haunting the mundane places of everyday life, collecting small mementos of the life that had been stolen from him. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. The red shirt, the glove, the shoe. the photograph. They weren't random. They were his pattern. They were the signature of his grief, the calling cards of his obsession. He wasn't just a stalker. He was a collector of lost things, a man so broken by his own loss that he had dedicated his life to intruding on the lives of others, taking small, symbolic pieces of them for himself. He was a ghost, haunted by the memory of his own son, and in turn, he had become a haunter of others. The laundromat was his church. The tumbling clothes a reminder of the cycles of life, and the forgotten items were his sacred relics. He had chosen me, not out of malice in the way I understood it, but because I fit his pattern. A solitary woman, a creature of the night, a life he could observe and collect from without interruption. This new knowledge did not bring me comfort. It terrified me on a deeper level. I was not dealing with a simple criminal. I was dealing with a man whose actions were fueled by a bottomless, inconsolable grief. His motivations were not rational. He was not someone I could reason with or scare away with a loud noise. He was a man with nothing left to lose, a human black hole of sorrow. And I had become the object of his broken, obsessive attention. My plan to confront him with alarms and lights now seemed absurdly naive. How do you scare a man whose entire existence is already a waking nightmare? How do you intimidate someone who has already lost everything that matters? My anger, my desire for a simple, violent confrontation, was useless against the profound, complex machinery of his grief. I was not dealing with a predator. I was dealing with a wound that had festered and become something monstrous. I looked at the mugshot again, at the hollow, haunted eyes of Arthur Penn, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than fear or anger. It was a strange, unwelcome pity. He was not a monster. He was a man, broken by a tragedy so immense it had shattered his mind, leaving him to endlessly haunt the mundane places where normal life, the life that had been stolen from him, continued on without him. But this pity did not make me feel safer. It made me feel more afraid. A simple monster can be fought. A grieving, obsessive man with no connection to reality is unpredictable. His actions were not governed by logic, but by the fractured, sorrowful whims of his trauma. I was not just a target. I was a symbol, a stand-in for the life he could no longer have, and that made me infinitely more vulnerable. Then, a horrifying thought occurred to me. He had left the clipping for me to find. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act of self-revelation. He had watched me prepare my trap, had understood my shift from victim to hunter, and had decided to reveal a piece of himself to me. He was escalating the intimacy of our bizarre, one-sided relationship. He wanted me to know who he was. He wanted me to understand. My trap was not a surprise to him. It was an invitation, one that he had answered not with his presence, but with his story. He was showing me his cards. He was telling me, "You cannot beat me with noise and light. My pain is louder than any alarm you can trigger." The power dynamic shifted once again. I had come here thinking I was the hunter, but I had only been following a new set of breadcrumbs he had left for me. I stood up, the newspaper clipping clutched in my hand. The laundromat felt different now. It was no longer just a hunting ground. It was a church of sorrow, Arthur Penn's private memorial to his son, and I was the unwilling parishioner. I looked at my abandoned laundry, at the tools in my bag, and felt a profound sense of futility. I had come here for a confrontation, but I had been met with a confession. I decided to leave. My plan was useless. My anger was gone, replaced by a deep, weary dread. There was no winning this game. There was only surviving it. I gathered my things, leaving my unwashed laundry behind. I would have to find a new way to live, a new place to perform my chores. The spin cycle was lost to me forever. It was his territory, his church, and I was no longer welcome. I was about to walk out the door, to leave the clipping and the ghost of Arthur Penn behind me, when the lights went out. All of them. The entire laundromat was plunged into an instantaneous, absolute darkness. The familiar, constant hum of the machines died, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. My heart leaped into my throat. The game was not over. He wasn't going to let me leave. I fumbled in my bag for the flashlight I had brought, my fingers clumsy in the sudden dark. I clicked it on, its powerful beam cutting a sharp, nervous path through the gloom. The room was the same, the machines standing like silent white tombstones. I was alone, but I knew I wasn't. The darkness was a new stage, and the final act was about to begin. And then, a single light flickered to life. It was not one of the overhead lights. It was a pale, sickly green-white light, and it came from inside the large industrial dryer, directly in front of me. The one next to my usual dryer. The one where the red shirt had first appeared. The light from within the drum was flickering, buzzing, casting strange, moving shadows. And slowly, with a low, mournful groan, the empty, dryer drum began to tumble. I was paralyzed, my flashlight beam a trembling, useless spear of light in the overwhelming darkness. The only other illumination came from the dryer, its sickly, flickering internal light painting the room in strobing, monstrous shadows. The low, groaning rumble of the empty, tumbling drum was the only sound, a slow, metallic heartbeat in the corpse of the laundromat. He had cut the power. He had plunged us into his own private world of darkness and light. My plan to create chaos seemed like a pathetic joke now. He had beaten me to it. He had created his own far more terrifying spectacle. I was no longer the hunter. I was just a frightened woman, trapped in a dark room with a ghost who knew how to work the fuse box. My carefully laid plans, my alarms, my spray paint, they were all the tools of a world that no longer existed. The world of logic and electricity. I was in his world now. I couldn't take my eyes off the tumbling dryer. The motion was hypnotic, dizzying. The pale light from within cast shifting patterns on the walls, making the other machines look like they were breathing, their metal bodies expanding and contracting in the gloom. The rhythmic, groaning squeak of the drum was a sound of immense age and weariness, the sound of a machine being forced to perform a task it was not designed for. It was the sound of his grief, slow, mechanical, and relentless. And then I saw the face. It was there, inside the drum, amidst the tumbling metallic emptiness. For a split second, as the drum rotated past the glass door, I saw it. The gaunt, pale face of Arthur Penn from the mugshot, his eyes dark, hollow voids. He was being tossed in the darkness, illuminated by the sickly light, his expression one of profound, unending sorrow. It was an image so impossible, so grotesquely surreal, that my mind buckled under the strain of it. Was he physically inside the machine? The thought was absurd, impossible. He couldn't be. It had to be a reflection, a trick of the light and my own terrified imagination. my brain projecting the image from the newspaper clipping onto the glass. But as the drum completed another slow rotation, the face appeared again, in the same spot, its hollow eyes seeming to stare directly at me before it was tumbled away into the darkness once more. Real or not, the effect was the same. A scream, raw and pure, tore itself from my throat. This was his final masterpiece. This was the ultimate violation. He had placed himself inside the very machine where his game had begun, turning it into a macabre carousel, a ghostly effigy of his own pain. He was showing me his suffering in the most literal, terrifying way imaginable. He was showing me what it was like to be him, endlessly tumbling in a dark, empty space. That scream broke my paralysis. The terror, which had frozen me, now propelled me into action. My hunter's instinct, which had been smothered by the sheer impossibility of the situation, roared back to life. I would not be a spectator to this final, insane performance. I ripped the personal alarm from my bag, my thumb finding the pin. I did not hesitate. I pulled it with all my strength. The sound that erupted was a physical assault. A high, piercing electronic shriek, so loud it felt like it was splitting my skull open. It was a sound of pure, technological panic. A beautiful, ugly contrast to the groaning analog horror of the dryer. I fumbled for the second alarm and pulled its pin as well, adding its voice to the chorus. The small room was now a vortex of unbearable shrieking noise. But I wasn't done. I grabbed the powerful flashlight from my bag and aimed it at the dryer, my thumb mashing the button for the strobe function. The room, which had been a canvas of darkness and eerie green light, now became a chaotic, disorienting storm of flashing, strobing white light and shrieking sound. The face in the dryer, whether real or imagined, was lost in the chaos. I had thrown my own crude, desperate light and noise into his carefully orchestrated darkness. I was no longer screaming. I was just standing there, in the center of the storm I had created, the strobe light flashing, the alarms shrieking. I had turned the room into pure sensory overload. It was a chaotic, desperate act of defiance. It was my refusal to be a passive audience to his pain. If this was his theater, I was going to be the one to burn it to the ground. The shrieking of the alarms was a physical wall of sound, and the strobing light was a chaotic, disorienting barrage. In the midst of my own sensory assault, the impossible light inside the dryer flickered one last time and died. The slow, groaning tumble of the drum wound down, coming to a final, shuddering halt. The face, my terrifying specter, was gone. The stage was dark. The performance was over. My chaos had conquered his. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I didn't wait to see if Arthur Penn would emerge from the shadows. I turned and ran, leaving the alarms shrieking into the empty, darkened room. I shoved the glass door open and sprinted out into the blessed, silent sanity of the night. I left everything behind, my laundry, my book, my bag. I was shedding the skin of my old life, abandoning the props of my own haunting. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I didn't look back. I knew there would be nothing to see. He was a ghost, a master of appearing and disappearing. The police would find an empty laundromat, a few personal alarms shrieking on the floor, and a story from a terrified woman that made no logical sense. There would be no proof, no suspect, no resolution. I knew this with a bone-deep certainty. That night was the end of my life in that apartment. I broke my lease. I moved. I left most of my belongings behind, convinced they were contaminated by my experience. My sister helped me find a new place, a small apartment in a newer, characterless building on the other side of the city. The most important feature, the only one I insisted upon, was that it had its own in-unit washer and dryer. I would never set foot in a public laundromat again. Life is quiet now. I still work the night shift at the hospital, but my routines are different. They are built around the concept of self-containment. I do my laundry in my own small laundry closet, with the door firmly shut. I read my books in the safety of my own locked living room. I have tried to build a new sanctuary, a fortress with no public access points, no shared spaces where a ghost might leave a gift. But the trauma is a quiet, constant companion. I am a perpetual listener. Every strange noise, every flicker of a light, sends a jolt of the old fear through me. I see his face sometimes when I close my eyes, the hollow, haunted eyes of Arthur Penn, a man so lost in his own grief that he tried to pull me in with him. I survived, but I am not the same person who once found peace in the hum of a machine. I tell myself that it's over. He was tied to that place, to his ritual. By removing myself from his territory, I have removed myself from his game. He has lost his favorite player. He will have to find someone else to watch, someone else to leave his sorrowful mementos for. I have to believe this to get through the day. I have to believe that the haunting was tied to a location, not to a person. But last night, something happened. I was taking my clean clothes out of my own dryer, in my own safe apartment. As I gathered up the warm, clean fabrics, a single item fell to the floor. It was a sock. A small white sock, the kind a young boy might wear. It was not mine. I have no children. It was not a sock that had been left over from a previous load. The machine was brand new when I moved in. I stood there, in the silence of my own home, staring at the small, impossible sock on the floor. It was a relic from a game I thought had ended, a message from a ghost I thought I had left behind. The board was bigger than I had ever imagined. His obsession was not with a place. It was not with a routine. It was with the act of watching, of collecting, of reminding the world of the small things that can be lost in an instant. And I knew, with a certainty that was a cold, sharp knife in my heart, that it was not over. I had left his church, but he had followed me home. The game had not ended. He had just changed the board, and I am left with the terrifying, unending question: what will he leave for me next?